The Order 1886 was definitely one of the more controversial exclusives from the PlayStation 4 era. The game was released in February of 2015 and was developed by Ready at Dawn. Ready at Dawn was a developer who started by releasing Daxter for the PSP in 2006, then God of War Chains of Olympus in 2008, and also made the Okami port to the Wii in 2008 as well. And then in the early 2010s, they worked on some more God of War games, and then finally took a few years off to develop The Order 1886, which was a brand new ambitious IP. The game itself was published by Sony and was definitely met with mixed reviews. Currently, the game has a 63 on Metacritic, and while it was praised for its photorealistic graphics and an interesting story, the game was very short and was more of an experience like a film than anything else, and really did not have much replay value for an under 10-hour game that was priced at $60. Now, no sales numbers are actively available because Sony really doesn't like to release them unless it does amazingly well, but the CEO of Ready at Dawn said in an interview with Polygon that the game was huge at first, but has stayed consistent over time. Rumors of a sequel have started to circulate around the internet recently, so I thought now was a good time to go over everything we know about the Order 1886 sequel. All sources, if still available, will be provided in the description, so feel free to check those out as well. And with that, let's get right into it. Now, the original Order 1886 was announced at E3 in 2013 and was shown before the PS4 was released. And the marketing strategy was to show the power of the PS4 and how good games could look. Because say what you will about the Order 1886, it did look amazingly well, despite all of its gameplay flaws. Now that we are approaching a new generation of consoles, it could be a similar situation where we start see marketing for how good the Order sequel will look on the PS5, but we will get into all of that later. And I think we probably could see that again, used for marketing to help push the game and this new hardware. Let's start with an interview from October of 2016 between Game Informer and Ready at Dawn studio co-founders. There's really only one clip I want to show where they mention the sales numbers one more time and if there is a future for the franchise past the Order 1886.
So, I'm assuming Sony communicated sales numbers after the game came out. Do you guys have any idea of where expectations were and where the Order eventually landed?
Yes. Unfortunately, we can't share them with you guys since Sony doesn't usually share numbers. But yeah, we talked about it with Sony, and they did share the numbers with us.
Is there a future for the Order franchise?
The best way to answer that, without giving anything, how can I say this? Is there a future? Yes, that IP has a future. It definitely is built into the IP. That future is something that was built from the very get-go, from the first day we started working on it. It wasn't built, as you know, since you played the game, and for the ones who played out there, yeah. There is a larger storyline. There's a macro story that keeps going. There's an IP that is actually bigger than even the storylines that we created. So there are legs to this IP, definitely.
And Sony sees it as like, that was a hell of an investment. We're gonna keep pushing this baby.
Well, you have to ask Sony that.
Okay.
Now, one thing I want to mention is even though that they are the developers and creator of this IP, Sony is actually the one who technically owns it. Most likely because it would have been too big of a risk for Ready at Dawn to develop by themselves and really had little leverage to convince Sony to let them make this game. So it was really up to Sony to push this new game out if they want one. Ready at Dawn can't just decide they want a sequel. It would have to be Sony's approval, and Sony would have to ask them basically, let's get this game moving. And we know this from a direct quote from Paul Sams, the CEO of Ready at Dawn, when he said, quote, "We want to build, own, and publish our own IPs in the future. We are in the process of trying to figure out how we will be able to achieve that goal. As for The Order, it was absolutely the company's desire to own it. We love that game and we are proud of it. Unfortunately, we were at a point in the company's evolution where owning that IP was not possible. We hope to not find ourselves in that position again." End quote. Now let's move on to a newer interview through Polygon. They were able to sit down with the creative director of Ready at Dawn and discuss all things Order 1886. The first question I want to touch on says, quote, "The Order 1886 came out over 3 years ago, and you have released 2 or 3 games since. With all that time between you and the project, what are your thoughts on the game?" He responded saying, quote, "That game was a huge thing as far as our studio was concerned, the amount of work to get it there. Looking back at it, of course, we look at it as a great first step into a new IP. We look at it also as us spreading our wings in many ways and learning a lot that ultimately we carried over after this game." So he does mention that this game is only the first step into a new IP and implies there is going to be more in the Order franchise, and that they did learn from this title, but we will get a more direct answer about a sequel later on in this interview. The next question I want to mention says, quote, "So let me ask you about the flip side of all this. What do you think were the shortcomings of the Order?" And his response said, quote, "I think the shortcomings come from so much concentration on building an IP at the very beginning. We were so dead set on making sure this IP had a foundation, a big foundation, that stories could be told in so many different ways. At one point, the IP and the story was driving a lot of work that we were trying to do. It's kind of natural when you start a very new game. We've seen that with new IPs in the past. We're not the first ones. There have been so many IPs in the past that were first, and if you look at the level of gameplay and complexity, oftentimes it's much smaller than it might be in a sequel. You need to set up the IP. You don't have time to do everything, so you rely on fewer mechanics, and the sequel really brings you to a point where you're like, all right, we'll expand everything." So he basically is saying that for the first game in an IP, you have to make it stand out and make something completely new. And then the follow-up, you can kind of narrow it down to what worked and what didn't and make a more polished experience, which I'm excited. It does sound like they took the criticism to heart and know what to change for the future. And the next question from the interview says, quote, "Before it came out, Sony was really pushing it and promoting it, and you have never been shy in the past about saying the team made the first with sequels in mind. The game ends on a cliffhanger, but we really haven't seen anything from it since. Is there a future for the series?" He says, quote, "It's hard for me to answer that one. I will tell you the same answer I would have given in the past before the Order came out. The IP was built with a lot of work behind it. Even before the release of the game, we put in a lot of work on the foundation of why each of these characters are who they are, where they came from, what is behind the story. Not 1886, but what's behind the story. We asked, where did it start? Where is it going? There's a lot of story that was already written because we felt, again, writing a game and just kind of isolating it to just the story that it would have been was not enough for us." Here, he mentions more directly that they had set up a big foundation for the series. They wanted to write and thought about ideas bigger than the game. They thought about the beginning, what's led up to the game, and I assume what's going to happen after the game, which is really reassuring that they had kind of a whole story planned out before they even started the first one. So hopefully they do have a lot of story to touch on for future games. And this article was written in 2018, so they had ideas for the sequel even back then. And the final question I want to mention is the creative director mentions that he wants to get the studio back to third-person, high-budget console games, which seems pretty specific compared to what they've done before, and it definitely sounds like an Order 1886 sequel. The question said, quote, "Your games since have been pretty different. Do you see Ready at Dawn wanting to go back to something like a high-budget third-person shooter?" He responded saying, "Yeah, absolutely. We have it in our DNA. We've kind of gone to many different places in game design, in game genre, in the ways stories are told. From a platformer to an action game to an RPG to a combat game to a VR experience to a third-person shooter. For 15 years, we've done a lot of different things. But also, again, it's a tribute to the team and the talent of the team. They had a drive to basically explore, become better, like personally as a developer, how can you improve your craft? All those people took those challenges on, so for us to go back to bigger budget and make something on console, yeah, it's in our DNA. We will always kind of have that balance. I think the studio is never stuck on one thing." Now, he mentions going back to third-person games because The Order was released in 2015, and this interview was 2018. The other games he mentioned that they developed were a multiplayer brawler game called Deformers and a narrative adventure game called Lone Echo. So it makes sense that they've had a few years to kind of get away from The Order, develop, get better at their craft, and now they're ready to revisit it with everything they've learned and probably make what I think will be an amazing sequel. Now let's fast forward to May of 2019. Ready at Dawn was promoting their VR game Long Echo 2 and did an interview with VentureBeat with the creative director at Ready at Dawn. When asked about developing VR titles and working on immersion, this is what he had to say. Quote, "We're working on a AAA console title right now, something we're developing internally. And funny enough, a lot of lessons we've learned about narrative and immersion and gameplay mechanics, we're taking some of those lessons into console. It might not be the same display device, but the play agency we learned to do in this game, you're always there. You can never expect the player to do what you want from them. They'll do whatever they want. That's something we're carrying with us to the console." Which to me, this definitely sounds like a AAA console title. Sounds like it could be an Order sequel, considering what they worked on in the past. It just makes sense. The follow-up question said, "Are you announcing that one anytime soon?" And he responded saying, "No, not yet. It's incubating internally. It's in the prototype phase, where we're building a lot of things internally. We're funding it ourselves right now. It's been a lot of fun taking some of those lessons and bouncing them back and forth between two projects." And the final question was, quote, "It's the Order 2, right?" He responded saying, "That's a bigger question. Soon enough, we'll be able to talk about it. Hopefully, as you might imagine, we get that question quite a lot." So at this point, it does sound like most likely the third-person game they were teasing back in 2018 is an Order sequel. Now, he does say it's just in the prototyping phase in May of 2019, which wasn't too far back, but at least they're working on it. They've learned a lot. And it looks like at some point they might have gotten the IP back from Sony. He does say they are self-funding it themselves right now. And in that original article I mentioned back in 2015, the CEO did say that they didn't have access to the IP from Sony. So I couldn't find any article where it mentioned them getting it back. If they are developing an Order sequel, that's what has to have happened. And if we get to the leaks further on, it'll make more sense on why I think they got it back from Sony and why it probably won't be a PS4 exclusive anymore. So now we got to move up to 2019 when we got our first fake rumor, but I think it's worth mentioning just because we are covering everything we know about the game. The narrative writer at Sucker Punch Games, Jordan Lamos, was a guest on the Gamerheads Video Game Podcast Network. And they were talking about games they get defensive of when people hate on them, so Jordan brought up the Order 1886 as an example and said, quote, "Especially since I guess they're making a sequel. I don't know if it's the Order 1887. The host responded saying, "Are they really? Are they following through with that?" And Jordan said, "Last I heard, yeah. They were doing a second one, so I don't know like if they're already having a development at that point or if they were like, well, let's just keep going and hoping the next one's better or people like it more kind of thing." Now, after this quote came out, stories started to get published, and this got a lot of traction because people thought Jordan might have some inside knowledge at the game because he is in the industry, and it does kind of make sense. But then he took to Twitter and said, quote, "Before this gets any more out of hand, I know nothing about the sequel. These are the types of articles I read last year and remembered reading 11 months later as there was one coming. Sorry to disappoint," and included some pictures of articles that he had read thinking that a sequel was a for sure thing. Which at the time, I would say is probably still a safe assumption to have, that the game is in development, but I don't think it was right for members of the community to take what he was saying as fact. And the audio was eventually cut out of the podcast, so people cannot go back and grab that, which is why we're only using the quote. Now after that, we can move all the way up to 2020 when a prominent leaker on NeoGAF, Osiris Black, who was known for leaking the PS4 Pro months before it was announced, recently gave a description for an unnamed game demo that is for the next generation of consoles. His post said, quote, "Man walks into a dimly lit room. Light bleeds across the room from a shoulder-mounted communication device. It's the most light in the scene. There's a light mist and sparks spew from a torn electrical wire, tossing light and particles around as the man cautiously makes his way across the room. His boots leave prints as he walks across the polished floors, the dim light showing his reflection in the floor. The wire behind him cracks and slows as it comes to a stop, along with all of the other lights in the room shutting off at the same time. The man covers the device on his shoulder, but the light bleeds through his hand. The man pulls a firearm and continues making his way through the large sterile room. A noise behind him, and he turns around, removing his hand from the device on his shoulder, revealing himself to everyone. The light illuminates the room, and a table he had walked past has been knocked over. The tablecloth is still slowly settling on the floor, along with all of the other things from the table have been strewn about. Off in the distance, a pair of yellow eyes open and fix on the man. You will know who he is, but I cannot say. He raises his arm and fires off several shots, the flash from the gun illuminating the darkness as the creature reels, then attacks. Another set of eyes open as it runs across the room at him. You can see the impact of the weapon punching holes in this thing as it makes its way across the room. The man backpedals and falls down. Monster is right on top of him at this point. Over something as he is trying to get away. He fires off a few more shots on his back and scampers to his feet. The monster is still chasing him, makes the way to the next room and slams the door behind him. You hear a series of clicks and other weird noises coming through the door. The man leans against it and you hear a deep inhalation come from the other side of the door, like the creature is sniffing around for a scent. The man is breathing heavily and removes one hand from the door and clutches his side. Blood is running down his side and his pant leg and pooling under the door. Last shot is of the creature kneeling on the other side of the door, putting one hand to the blood. Creature has 4 arms and smelling it. I have found you. He almost sings the word and then the title screen shows and that's it. One update says, let's see if anyone else can get this detailed. It's the best looking anything that I've ever seen, and the character models, lighting, and physics are on another level. The main character is impossible to confuse with anyone else, and this game has not been revealed, but I have hinted at it several times. This is not a cutscene or a render target, it's the actual gameplay, and it is very impressive. Well, the end is a cutscene, but man, you can literally not tell the difference, and yes. He gave a few updates after the initial post, and the first update said this was definitely all one shot. There were no loading screens, nothing like that. The second edit, he said, I was just given the go-ahead to post this, and it is from an early vertical slice that I did get to see. And before anyone asks, no, I cannot describe what the man is wearing because it would be a dead giveaway. Now, he ended up removing the picture sometime after it was posted. I'm not sure what it was, and I really wasn't able to find it anywhere. So I'm not sure, but it's probably still safe to assume that it would have given it away, which still has me thinking the order, just because it is such a specific time piece. If you see what they're wearing, you can most likely guess what the game is. The third update he gave when asked if this was a PS5 or Xbox title, all he said was yes, which community members have taken to mean that the game will no longer be a Sony exclusive, which makes sense with some of the past interviews I have mentioned. The fourth update came from when a fan asked, quote, I'm not asking for a pick, I just want to know if we've seen a creature like this in the IP you're referring to. Osiris responded, yes, sort of, just this one is ancient. But it's not the creature in the video you have all been posting. It carries a curse that you can be afflicted with. Now, there's a ton in this, and it kind of has been varying back and forth what game people think this is referencing. When it said the 4 yellow eyes, people were thinking that it might be a new Resistance game, but after the update with the curse that you are afflicted with, it started to sound more like The Order, at least to me and a few others. He also said that the monster has insect-like movement, which makes it sound like the Resistance once again. The shoulder-mounted communication device could go either way. It could mean a radio in just a normal game, or some new technology in The Order. Overall, I'm not sure. I've been looking into future Resistance games before, and if a new one is in development, and almost nothing is out there. Resistance also usually isn't known for very realistic graphics, and on top of that, the last Resistance game was not selling very well. So I would say it's unlikely that they are developing a sequel Resistance 4 title that is so much different than past titles. So I would say The Order is more likely based off hints from the developer and interest from the developer to make a sequel, when the developers behind Resistance have been hesitant to revisit the series. That's just me. This obviously is still a leak, so it could all be false. But the reason I chose to include it is because I would tend to say this is probably related to the Order 1886 sequel. But with that final leak, that is everything we know about the game. If this leak is true, it does make me excited that graphics are even better than they were for the original game. I'm glad that this also isn't just a PS5 exclusive, that it can go to multiple consoles so everyone can get a chance to play it. And that's where I'm going to end this video. Make sure to like and share, subscribe for weekly gaming news, and I will see you guys in the next one.